The desert stretched wide and silent, its heat rising in shimmers that blurred the horizon. The man had walked this path many times before, tracing the dry riverbed where the sand gathered in long ridges, but on this day something unusual caught his eye. At first it seemed like a stone or a mound of earth, half buried and still. But as he drew closer, the shape revealed itself to be fur, golden and dull beneath the sun, pressed low into the earth as if the body carried no weight of its own. For a long moment, the scene appeared lifeless. The lion lay unmoving, her frame gaunt, bones visible beneath the rough skin. The air around her quivered with heat, and the only sound was the faint whisper of wind dragging across sand. Then, just barely, he saw it, a shallow rise, the smallest pull of breath that lifted her ribs before sinking back again. It was the single sign that life still held to her, fragile and nearly invisible. He slowed his steps, instinctively lowering his pace. Approaching a predator was never done in haste, but this was no predator in strength. Her head rested flat on the sand, eyes closed, the edges crusted from days of exhaustion. Her ears twitched once, a faint reflex against the grit carried by the wind, but otherwise her body remained slack. Every rib showed with startling clarity, each curve of bone sharper than it should be. The man stopped a few meters away, his throat tight with a mix of awe and sadness. He had seen lions before. Strong and fierce beneath the African sun, their muscles carrying them like storms across the plains. But here was a lion stripped of all strength, reduced to stillness in the middle of the desert. The harsh land gave no mercy. For a predator at the edge of collapse, every breath was borrowed time. He whispered without thinking. The words carried softly across the sand. "Easy now. You're still here." His voice barely broke the silence, yet in the quiet world around them, it sounded louder than he expected. The lion's ear flicked again, this time with a hint of recognition. Slowly, her head shifted, eyes half opening with effort. They were dull, clouded by exhaustion, but they met his gaze for a fleeting second. It was not aggression. There was no strength for that. It was simply awareness, the faint spark that showed she had not yet surrendered. Her chest moved with shallow rhythm, each breath a fragile fight against the weight of heat and hunger. When her sides lifted, her belly hollowed in such a way that spoke of many days without food. Her whiskers twitched as if testing the air, but her body never moved to rise. Even the act of lifting her head seemed beyond reach. The man crouched slowly, his movements measured, respectful of the fragile line between them. He did not reach out, nor step too close. He simply observed, grounding himself in the reality that this was a wild creature, even if weakened. In the stillness, time seemed to slow. The desert carried its silence around them, as though the world itself was waiting to see what choice would be made. A low sound escaped the lion's throat. Not a roar, not even a growl, but a strained moan that spoke of fatigue. It rose like a sigh, thin and broken, before fading into the open air. She shifted one paw, dragging it slightly against the sand as though trying to remind her body how to move. The effort left her trembling, the paw falling back in defeat. The man felt a weight press against him, the gravity of witnessing life balanced so close to its end. This lion was not only a predator, not only a symbol of power, she was also vulnerable now. Her survival cut down to the smallest thread. He breathed slowly, steadying his own body in response. The sun beat down overhead, its light unrelenting, and still she lay in its burn. Her tongue flicked once against dry lips, a sign of thirst more desperate than any hunger. Every part of her body seemed to cry out for what the desert had denied: water, shade, rest. The man's hand moved to the canteen at his side, though he did not yet open it. First he watched her eyes. They had closed again, her lashes trembling against her cheek. She seemed caught between two worlds, one of endurance and one of surrender. The man remained kneeling, simply present in that fragile moment. Around them, the sand shifted faintly in the wind, whispering along the surface. A hawk traced a circle above, its shadow drifting across the lion's body before vanishing again into the brightness. The desert offered no comfort, only its quiet witness. The man finally lowered himself further, resting on one knee, and whispered again, "Hold on. Just hold on." The lion did not move, but her chest rose once more, shallow yet steady. It was enough to tell him she was still fighting, even in silence. The shape that had first seemed lifeless in the sand now revealed itself as something else entirely, a presence caught between despair and survival, waiting for the smallest act to tip the balance. The desert held its breath with them as man and lion shared the same fragile stillness, both aware that the next choice could mean the difference between life and loss. The lion's shallow breaths continued, each rise and fall of her chest weaker than the last. But the man remained still, watching carefully. His hand moved with measured calm, unscrewing the cap of his canteen. The faint sound of metal against metal carried through the dry air, and though her body barely shifted, her ears twitched toward it. Her eyes opened once more, slow and heavy, clouded by fatigue. Yet they did not leave him. There was no strength for aggression, no will to retreat, only a tired awareness. He crouched lower, careful to keep a respectful distance. The desert pressed down in silence, heat shimmering between them. And he tipped the canteen gently, letting a small stream fall onto the sand just in front of her. The water darkened the grains where it pooled, vanishing almost as quickly as it touched. The lion stirred faintly, her nose twitching at the scent, but her head did not rise. Her tongue flicked once against her dry lips, instinct chasing the promise of relief. The man hesitated, then tried again, this time letting a few drops spill into the hollow of his palm. Slowly, he extended his hand, leaving space for her to decide. The lion's eyes followed, narrowing faintly as though the effort of focusing drained what little she had left. For a moment she remained motionless, chest heaving with the steady rhythm of struggle. Then, with a low sound, something between a moan and a sigh, she shifted her muzzle an inch closer. The movement was slow, unsteady, but it carried intent. Her nose brushed against his hand, testing, before her rough tongue flicked across his skin, drawing the water into her mouth. The man did not move, his body steady, offering more drops with patient silence. Each time she licked, it seemed to cost her effort, yet she persisted, driven by need deeper than caution. He whispered, almost beneath his breath, "That's it. Take what you need." The lion's ears twitched again, but she did not retreat. Her eyes lifted briefly to his face, dull but steady, before falling closed once more. She pressed her chin to the ground as if even the act of drinking had drained her, but there was a subtle change now. The tension that had first bound her body had eased, replaced by something quieter. She had accepted his presence, if only for the sake of survival. The man refilled his palm and offered more, pausing each time she stopped. Drops slipped from his hand and sank into the thirsty sand, but he did not hurry her. When her tongue no longer reached, he withdrew, letting her rest. The silence returned, but it felt altered, carrying not only the weight of struggle but also a fragile thread of connection. She shifted one paw, dragging it against the ground. The claws extended slightly, catching in the sand, before retracting again. The motion was not hostile. It was weak, almost absent-minded, but it marked her faint attempt to test her own strength. Her ribs lifted more sharply with each breath now, her body working harder than before, yet there was also a faint resilience in the way she held her head a fraction higher. The man studied her carefully. Every part of her told the story of days without food or water, the sunken flanks, the hollowed cheeks, the stiffness in her movements. But her eyes, when they opened again, held a trace of focus. They followed him with deliberate intent, not simply drifting as before. He shifted back slightly, lowering his gaze to give her space. The lion's ears turned toward him still, but she made no attempt to move closer or away. Between them, the desert seemed to hold a boundary line, not of fear, but of recognition. She was wild, and he was human, yet in that quiet balance, something unspoken had begun. The wind stirred lightly, carrying fine dust across the ground. A grain settled on the lion's whiskers, and she twitched them once before letting them fall still again. The man poured a final small pool of water into the sand nearby, not forcing her to take it from his hand this time. She leaned her head forward, tongue flicking against the wet ground, drawing what she could before pulling back. Her breathing steadied, still shallow, but less strained. Her chest no longer shuddered with each effort, though fatigue weighed on every part of her frame. She laid her head down once more, but not with the same hopeless slackness as before. This time, her eyes remained half open, fixed quietly on the man as if measuring his next move. He lowered his voice again, soft and steady. "Rest now. You're safe." She did not close her eyes immediately. Instead, her gaze lingered on him for a few breaths more, and in that silent exchange, a fragile trust formed. It was not born of comfort, nor of bond, but of necessity. Yet within it was something deeper, a shared recognition between two beings who had crossed paths at the thinnest edge of survival. As the desert heat swirled around them, the lion's eyes finally closed. The man remained crouched, still and quiet, watching over her in the fragile pause between suffering and recovery. The silence pressed in once more, but now it carried with it the faint sound of hope. The lion stirred before the sun had climbed much higher, her body shifting with effort as she pulled her forelegs beneath her chest. The man, still sitting quietly a short distance away, watched as her sides rose and fell in deep, uneven breaths. Her ribs lifted sharply, each motion carrying strain, but there was determination in the slow press of her paws against the earth. She pushed upward, her body trembling as muscles long starved of strength tried to remember their purpose. For a moment she rose, her front legs locked, hindquarters lifting just enough for her body to stand. Her shoulders swayed, the weight of her frame nearly buckling under its own demand. She staggered, claws digging into the sand as if searching for something solid beneath. The man held his breath, watching, ready to step closer should she fall. But she did not collapse, not yet. She steadied herself, eyes narrowing against the brightness, her flanks quivering as though every heartbeat carried her one step further from defeat. When she moved, it was not aimless. Her head lifted slightly, ears turning toward the distant ridge. She placed one paw forward, dragging it at first, then setting it more firmly with the next attempt. Her gait was uneven, her body frail, but her direction was steady. Each step pressed a clear print into the sand, marking a path across the barren plain. The man rose slowly, choosing not to interfere. He trailed behind, careful to leave space, his eyes fixed on the line of paw prints leading ahead. The desert stretched in silence around them, save for the low hiss of wind dragging grit across the ground. It was as though the land itself was watching, holding its breath as predator and man moved together across its emptiness. Her movements carried a quiet urgency. Weak as she was, she did not linger or pause to rest. Her head dipped low, her shoulders hunched forward, yet her steps remained directed. The man read something in that steadiness. It was not escape, nor was it wandering. It was intention, fragile yet insistent, pulling her toward a place unseen. They reached the edge of a shallow canyon where the desert floor broke into jagged stone and dips of shadow. The air was cooler here, the wind funneling gently between the rock walls. The lion stumbled once, her body pressing against the canyon's edge before she steadied herself. She pressed on, her paw prints now etched clearly into the dust of the narrow path. The man slowed, following with deliberate caution. He listened, each step measured until a faint sound reached him. A thin, high-pitched whimper carried on the canyon air. It was so soft at first he thought it might be wind whistling through stone. But then it came again, uneven, broken, like a cry too small for the vastness around it. The lion stopped, her head lifted, ears straining forward, and she gave a low rumble in response. It was weak, almost a whisper of a call, but it carried weight. The sound rolled through the canyon, not a roar of dominance, but a mother's voice reaching for something fragile. From deeper within the shadows came another reply, a chorus of faint cries, thin and desperate. The man's chest tightened at the realization. She had not wandered aimlessly to her collapse in the sand. Her struggle had not been for herself alone. Each weak step had been tethered to this hidden place. The lion pressed forward again, her body moving with renewed determination, though it shook beneath the effort. Her paws left smears in the dust where her claws dragged. Yet she did not falter. She moved toward the sound with the instinct of one who had carried life within her, now fighting to keep it alive. The cries grew clearer as they entered the canyon's bend. The man followed in silence, watching as her tail flicked weakly behind her, each sway of her body signaling exhaustion, yet driven by something stronger. She lowered her head again, rumbling once more, and this time the whimpering quickened in answer. Then the faint outlines became clear, shadows shifting against the pale stone. Two small figures lay close together in the dust, their bodies no larger than bundles of fur, ribs showing just as sharply as their mother's. They lifted their heads weakly, muzzles opening in hoarse calls, paws pawing faintly at the earth as she neared. The lion reached them, lowering herself with a shudder, her legs folding beneath her. She pressed her muzzle against the cubs, nudging one and then the other, her tongue rasping gently over their heads. They wriggled weakly, their cries turning softer as they nestled against her chest. Her body curved protectively around them, as if even in her frailty she could shield them from the world. The man stopped at the canyon's edge, watching from a respectful distance. He felt the weight of what unfolded before him, not simply a predator at the edge of survival, but a mother carrying the burden of lives beyond her own. The signs in the sand had led not to an end, but to a fragile beginning. Hidden in the silence of stone and dust, he whispered more to himself than to her. "So, this is where you were going." The lion did not look at him. Her attention was fixed entirely on her cubs, her nose brushing over them, her breaths warming their frail bodies. Yet the sound of their cries softening filled the canyon with something more than silence. It carried the faintest echo of survival, fragile but real, cradled in the dust and shadow of the desert's heart. The cubs' cries echoed faintly in the stone hollow, thin and broken as if they had nearly given up the will to call. Their bodies were fragile, limbs trembling as they struggled to push themselves closer to their mother. She lowered herself heavily beside them, her legs folding with a collapse that seemed more surrender than rest. Her breath rattled against their fur as she pressed her muzzle toward each one, nudging them gently as though reminding them she was still there. The cubs responded weakly, their heads lifting in small jerks, paws fumbling against her chest before sinking back again. The man stood at the mouth of the shallow cave, his frame half hidden in the shadow of the rock. He did not move quickly. He simply watched as the mother gathered her cubs against her, the curve of her body forming a wall of warmth in the cool canyon air. Every line of her form spoke of exhaustion, yet also of persistence. Her ribs heaved with each breath, but her nose brushed tenderly across the cubs' heads, her tongue rasping over their fragile fur. The cubs' cries were quieter now, muffled against her body, though their movements carried a restless urgency. Their mouths opened, searching, pressing against her belly in instinctive need. The mother shifted slightly, angling her body to accommodate them, but her strength faltered. Milk would not come easily to one so depleted. Their small jaws worked, their bodies trembling in hunger, and her chest shuddered with a low moan, part exhaustion, part frustration at her own limits. The man's eyes moved between mother and cubs, weighing the delicate line of intervention. He unscrewed his canteen again, the sound soft against the hush of the cave. A faint clink echoed across the stone walls, catching the lioness's ear. Her head lifted, her eyes meeting his in the dim light. They were sharp for only an instant before dulling again, the awareness fading into weariness. But she did not move against him, nor did she shield the cubs. Instead, she laid her chin back down across their tiny forms, her body trembling, but her gaze steady. He crouched, lowering the canteen, and poured a slow stream into a shallow curve of rock where the stone had dipped from years of erosion. The water pooled briefly before sinking into cracks, but enough remained for a thin shine to glisten in the hollow. The scent reached the lioness and her tongue flicked once against the air. She did not rise, but her head tilted, urging one cub gently with her nose. The cub stumbled forward, paws dragging clumsily across the ground, its ribs visible beneath the thin fur. It nosed at the hollow, its tongue flicking out to catch the water. The drops were few, but it drank greedily, its throat moving in tiny swallows. The second cub followed, weaker still, but the sight of its sibling drew it near. Both crouched over the small pool, lapping at what little remained. The man poured again, slow and steady, watching as the water vanished between their tongues. He did not speak this time. The silence felt sacred, broken only by the soft rasp of cubs drinking and the steady rasp of their mother's breath. Her eyes half closed, and though her body seemed to sink further into fatigue, there was a new rhythm in her chest, a steadier rise and fall, not so ragged as before. The cubs stumbled back to her side, pressing against her belly. Their cries had softened into whimpers, weaker but no longer frantic. The mother curled more tightly around them, her tail brushing faintly across their backs. Her head dropped heavily onto the earth, eyes closing, but her body's tension eased, as if she had let herself rest now that her young had found relief. The man remained kneeling, one hand still holding the canteen, the other resting loosely on his knee. He studied them quietly. The frailty of the cubs, the mother's unwavering determination despite her weakness. The desert had brought them to the edge, yet within this cave lay a fragile pulse of survival, strengthened by patience and small offerings of water. The cubs shifted again, one pressing its muzzle against its mother's chin as though urging her to respond. She lifted her head faintly, licked its face once, then let it nestle close. The sound that came from her chest was faint, a rumble nearly lost to the canyon's hush, but it carried the depth of her instinct. Even on the edge of collapse, she gave what she could, holding them to her with the last of her strength. The man let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, quiet and slow. "You're not alone," he murmured, the words more carried by the still air than spoken. Outside, the desert remained unrelenting, its heat and silence stretching without mercy. Yet within the cave, there was a different kind of stillness now. The cubs no longer cried out in despair, their tiny bodies pressed close, warmed by their mother's frail but enduring form. The man's presence, gentle and steady, wove into that moment like a thread, unseen but holding. For the first time since he had found her lying half buried in the sand, there was more than desperation in the air. There was a flicker of life, fragile, uncertain, but undeniably present, resting in the small movements of two cubs, the slow breath of their mother, and the patience of the man who chose not to turn away. The days passed in a rhythm shaped by patience and silence. Each morning, the man returned to the shallow cave with small offerings, measured streams of water, bits of meat dried from his own rations, placed carefully on the stone so as not to intrude. Each time, the lioness lifted her head a little higher, her eyes following his movements but never flashing with threat. Her cubs, once too weak to move beyond a trembling crawl, now pressed eagerly against her belly, their voices soft but insistent. Life, thin as a thread at first, began to weave itself back into their bodies. The lioness grew steadier with each sunrise. At first she only shifted from her side to her belly, her weight resting on forelegs that trembled beneath her. By the second day she attempted to rise. her paws spreading wide as she balanced, muscles straining with effort. Her cubs tottered at her side, squeaking in their small voices, and though her stance faltered, she did not collapse. She stood, if only for a few breaths, before lowering herself again. It was enough. The man kept his distance, never reaching toward her, never crossing the invisible boundary that kept her wildness intact. His role was quiet, almost unseen, placing water where she could drink, leaving when she turned her head to rest. He spoke only rarely, his voice low and even. Words meant more for the rhythm than their meaning. "Almost there," he whispered once as she steadied herself on her feet, her tail flicking weakly behind her. By the fourth day, strength had returned in visible ways. Her shoulders no longer shook with each step, and her eyes had lost the dull haze of exhaustion. The cubs followed her with greater energy, stumbling over one another in their eagerness. Their cries, once hoarse and broken, now carried a sharper edge, bouncing off the canyon walls with a sound that belonged to the living. That morning, she emerged from the cave fully, her paws pressing into the sand with a certainty not seen before. She paused at the mouth of the canyon, lifting her head into the wind. Her nostrils flared, catching the scents that drifted across the open desert. She rumbled low in her chest, a sound that drew the cubs to her side. They pressed against her legs, tiny bodies rubbing into her flanks as if to remind her they were ready. The man stood a short distance away, still and quiet. He felt the shift before it happened. The lioness stepped forward, not with the faltering gait of one clinging to life, but with the measured pace of one reclaiming it. Each stride was stronger than the last, her muscles recalling what hunger had nearly taken from her. Her cubs followed, stumbling at times, but always pulling themselves forward, their tails flicking as they learned the rhythm of her path. Halfway across the flat stretch of sand, she stopped. The wind caught her mane of rough fur, stirring the dust around her paws. Slowly, she turned her head, her gaze resting on the man. Her eyes were no longer dulled by weakness. They were steady, alive, reflecting the sun with a quiet strength. There was no sound, no movement beyond that look, but it carried weight. The man did not raise his hand or speak. He only stood, the silence between them heavy, yet unbroken. It was not gratitude in the human sense, nor was it farewell. It was acknowledgement, an unspoken recognition that their paths had crossed at the edge of survival, and that both now carried the mark of that moment. The lioness turned back, her tail swaying once before she moved forward again. Her cubs bounded clumsily behind her, their paws leaving small prints beside hers in the sand. Together they walked into the desert, their forms shrinking with distance until only the faint trace of movement stirred against the horizon. The man remained where he was, the sound of wind filling the silence they left behind. The canyon walls stood quiet, holding the memory of cries that had once echoed there, now replaced by absence. The desert stretched wide and endless, but it no longer felt empty. Somewhere within its vastness, a mother and her young moved onward, carrying with them the fragile thread that had been strengthened in shadow and stillness. The sun began to sink low, its light softening against the ridges of sand. The man exhaled slowly, letting the moment settle around him. He would leave soon, returning to his own path. But he knew the image of her final glance would remain. It would live in his memory, as surely as her tracks lived in the dust, destined to be swept away by the wind, yet never forgotten. As the last light touched the horizon, the desert breathed in silence once more. Only the faint whisper of wind moved across the sand, carrying with it the story of survival, quiet, unspoken, but real.